Hello, everyone. It is April 17th, 2023. This is week 3 of the term. And yeah, just going to get started by sharing screen. Okay. So today is elements of art and principles of design. There's a lot to cover here. There's some some of the other instructors usually take 1 week for both of these topics, but I'm putting it into 1 week. Okay. So yeah, elements design. We're gonna start with that first. Um, so in the following slides, you'll see these terms, bits in composition. Basically, bits is, let's call this a composition, which is basically one image or one picture or one painting or whatever. Um, that's the composition of all these little bits that comprise it. So this chonies would be a bit, this would be a bit, this arrow would be a bit, but the whole thing is a composition. Now, normally these are called elements that make up a composition, but since we're talking about elements of art, it would be confusing if I used that word. Okay, so yeah, the elements of art that we'll be talking about are line, shape, form, space, texture, color, and value. So just like the definition of art, there's no perfect, clean answer that everyone agrees upon. Um, these are generally the most popular, I guess you could say, elements of art, but yeah, some sources might vary a little bit. But generally, this will cover pretty much everything you'll come across. Okay. Okay, so we'll start off with line. But before we go there, first of all, a point is a 0D form. We're talking about like actual physical space, physics, science. Like a point is literally a 0D form, which means like a point in space where there's nothing extending from that. It exists in exactly one place. And so when you combine a bunch of these points and in a row like that, that turns it into one dimension. So a line is a series of points, essentially. Okay. So an easy way to sort of think about this is the example of a light rail. So with light rails, yeah, they curve like that and such, but you only want them to go forward and backward on the track. You don't want them to go left to right because that would mean they're off the track, which is very bad. So one dimension can exist in going like squiggling around, but not moving off of that line. So my daughter, the snake is not literally one dimensional, but she kind of her body mostly follows her head. So she kind of moves in a squiggly line, essentially. There's also this game. You can check out this link yourself. It's really cool. It's basically a video game that's only played in one dimension using colors. And yeah, this is from Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics, which we'll talk about later this term. Um, Here's ways he represents different emotions and feelings and such just using lines. So the way lines are used in art is extremely versatile. And even though like for example, um, like Serenity, like this isn't literally a picture of Serenity because that's an abstract concept, but the way he drew the lines might communicate that, right? Same thing with madness, intimacy, um, but you might disagree with those, but that's how he kind of um, draws those, and you get to interpret it how you want. So different kinds of lines. So gesture or a gestural line. These are lines that are quickly done. usually to sort of indicate movement or something less precise. For example, in drawing classes, you do gestural drawings where, as you can see on the left here, they're not so exact, right? You're getting a basically an impression of something, and not the definition. Okay. Contour lines are basically outlines without the details most of the time. And yeah, they define a shape of something more or less. So yeah, like if you shaded this leaf in, um, it would no longer be a contour drawing of the leaf. It's a contour drawing now because, as you can see, it's following the outline of this. Um, and so it's a little bit abstracted in that sense, but you can still kind of tell what it is. Calligraphic lines. So this is just writing done very fancy, basically. Um, like these lines, if you aren't familiar with calligraphy, they're basically flourishes, um, stylish flair added to calligraphy or to writing in a calligraphic style. Here's some poems my mom personally did herself. Um, she she almost got a certificate in calligraphy, but um, long story short, she couldn't, even though she was close to it. But yeah, she did really great stuff. So pretty cool. Cross hatching, again, we're still talking about lines here. Um, so we're using intersecting lines to sort of build up value, and we'll talk about value later, to indicate like shadow or light, or the lack of light rather. Uh, oops. So on the left, for example, these cross hatching lines are meant to evoke shade. Like this isn't a bright, sunny scene, right? You can tell that this is probably in the shade or at night, or something ominous happening, right? And you can also combine this with color as well. Okay, phantom lines are closure. So phantom lines are funny because they don't exist and they're not supposed to exist, but they're implied by the context around them. So as you can see on the left, the yellow left square, it's if you just look at it exactly as it is, you see splotches of black shapes and red as well. However, because we have brains that like to fill in information and make things complete, we see it as Pikachu, right? So our brains do this for like survival or whatever. But yeah, you don't just see exactly what it is. Your brain fills in the rest. Because we're smart, I guess. Same thing on the right, we see an S, even though it's not there. And on the bottom right, we see a white triangle, again, even though it's not there. And the reason these things kind of exist is because that's what our mind expects. But the reality is not the same. So I actually played and completed this game for the sake of the slide essentially. So it's this game called Closure where every you can hold light orbs and stuff, but um, if things are in shadow, if they're in black, they don't exist. So if you fall in, if you're not near light, you'll fall down. I thought it was pretty cool, and it's a really beautiful game. And yeah, I played it pretty much for this slide. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. All right. So implied lines. All right, implied lines are similar in a sense to phantom lines in that they don't actually exist. But what implied lines is the suggestion of lines. So we're not talking about physical lines that exist. We're talking about suggestions or movement. So what I mean by that is this. So you can see, like, for example, Jesus is at a diagonal line, and so we have this implied line through this composition of movement like this, for example. There's this person bending down, and the head and the head and the head here. All these in a row kind of have this sort of movement going that way. So they're implied. Um, this painting, which I talked about last week, I believe, um, this has a lot of implied movement and implied lines, right? So sort of on your own, just trace with your finger like some implied lines that you see there. Um, where does the direction of your eye go? Where does everything point to? Maybe things point away. Maybe there's different directions. So yeah, do that real quick. I'll give you a few seconds. Okay, so um, these are some lines, right? So we can see like going along this um, leg to the head, and then a lot of these lines are sort of like going up here, right? If we follow the body parts, that's where we our eyes tend to follow, right? And so also within this, there's counterpoints where this is not going towards here, right? This is another line, another what's it called? Implied line, right? So there's different ways to look at it. It's subjective, but mostly agreed upon by most people, I would say. So yeah, it's not exact, and that's why it's implied, because you could disagree, but mostly people will agree upon that. Like what's not listed here is this right here, this rope, right? There's a little bit of motion, or yeah, motion like that. So there's a lot of like it converges with this, like probably way down beyond the screen. So um, yeah, it's again, it's something that doesn't exist, and it's implied, and it's not subjective, or sorry, not objective. Horizontal lines. Okay. So this is another sort of class of lines. Um, so yeah, so horizontal lines, horizontal meaning left to right. Uh, these on their own are implied to be sort of restful, grounded, because they're parallel to Earth, right? So whether you're a flat earther or not a flat earther, I'm not. Um, it's parallel to the ground. So so when you lay down or lie down, I forget which one it is, um, you're more at rest, and it's easier, and there's less energy expended. So sometimes horizontal lines tend to sort of imply that sort of thing. I chose this image because the image is or the game is naturally done in this wide ratio, this landscape ratio. I don't know if it's 16 by 9 or whatever, but you can see it. It is a peaceful scene, more or less. These little bugs walking around that you can't interact with. Um, and then these long lines here where you just walk across. There's some verticality here, and here and here, but overall, this is more of a horizontal composition, right? It dominates the scene. Here's another very low quality image. It's from a old gallery thing, but yeah. So this one's important because there's a lot of motion going on here, right? So it doesn't exactly have that chill aspect to it, but what it does have is this grounded feeling of there's going in a line. So they're going, they're on Earth, they're going along from right to left, right? And it's this rectangular composition. So it's a very, very horizontal moving image, right? They're not jumping up or floating up or whatever. Vertical lines, these are interesting because, again, think about it in terms of your body. when you stand up. It's tall, like you're taller than when you're laying down. Obviously, it's more intimidating. It's a sense of strength because you do need muscles in order to stand, right? When your muscles have atrophied, it's harder to stand, so you need some sort of strength to stand. And that's kind of what's implied by strong vertical lines, right? So yeah, it's basically kind of the opposite of horizontal for obvious reasons. It also has this, yeah, again, the sense of being impressive, right? Like this is kind of a tense painting in the fact that, you know, there's a big hole you can fall into if you're not careful, right? And it has this sort of this not what's the word I'm looking for? Intimidation aspect to it. Just um, it's very, you don't want to mess with it essentially. And the next one is diagonal lines. So these are usually utilized to imply sort of motion and uneasiness, a lack of stability. So again, think of your body in space. If you're leaning like this, like Michael Jackson, like it's not stable, right? Like gravity's gonna take over. You're gonna fall over, pretty much. So yeah, this is sort of a tactic used to bring a sense of weirdness as well, uneasiness, and like this, for example, this is from Elden Ring. Um, like these pillars or they're of stone. So basically, like mountains and these formations are caused by tectonic plates like crashing into each other and then like forming up like that, right? So they're obviously not man-made. They kind of feel like they might fall over. They don't conform to horizontal or vertical, right? So they have this sense of weirdness. And yeah, and another thing that I guess I should put for next time is actually this exemplifies it well. It's called the Dutch angle. So in movies or film or move any sort of moving sort of medium, 4D medium, if you shoot something at an angle, it also has that sort of effect on it, right? So um I just saw a movie with this, but I can't remember. But a lot of like 90s music videos for like alternative music will use like these like angles that like move like this or whatever, and that creates that sense of, rebelliousness or alternativeness or whatever, which is essentially falling in line with diagonal lines. So just want to reiterate that these things can obviously be used with each other. These are examples where horizontal lines dominate, vertical lines dominate for this one, and diagonal lines dominate for this one. But yeah, as you can see, horizontal and vertical lines exist here. Hmm. All right, so shape. So back to talking about dimensions. Um, Point in space is 0D, as like these red dots would be here, and the line between them would be a line, which is 1D, but creating this open or this closed loop shape, this would be a shape, and that would be two-dimensional, right? So if we got rid of this one point, right here, then we could consider this a one-dimensional line. But however, this is on a graph, and we're clearly trying to demonstrate the x-axis here and the y-axis here, meaning it intentionally we're looking at it where it is a shape where it exists in two dimensions. Um, so yeah, so you can't really do the whole going back and forth on the tracks like a train thing. Like if you're doing that, then you're ignoring the second dimension here. So a line, a one-dimensional line can't exist in two dimensions, but a one-dimensional line can't exist in two dimensions. Um, Based on perspective. So kind of hard to really understand. Maybe, I don't know, but I hope that makes sense. So shapes. So yeah, obviously shapes. We recognize these as 2D. There's different kinds of shapes: regular, organic, mix, zigzag, accidental. The mix, zigzag, and accidental are more like types of shapes that are more subjective, whereas regular and organic are definitely ubiquitous. Okay. Um, so here's another classification I'm just going to skip over. It's just a slide for fun. So yeah, with just straight lines like that, we think of it as more pointed, and curved lines as more like bulbous or whatever. And so this is an interesting, the Buba-Kiki effect is a study done on that. Like most people identify the shape on the left as Kiki and the right as Buba just based on how it sounds. There's a lot of psychology going on with organic shapes, which is on the right, and um, what's it called? Uh, regular shapes, right? Which are used um, just lines and I guess circles too, but basically human-made geometry. Here's an example from a game. So it's basically you're in a robot environment, a very mechanical environment that's man-made that has all of these right angles. Um, and then you have a gun that shoots plants. So what you're trying to do is make this place have more plants, more organic life. So you shoot these and these plants come out, right? And you can see the contrast between these square robot things and the irregular shape, the organic shape of the leaves. Okay, figure ground relationship. Um, so this is an interesting way to think about shapes, right? So on the left, this is the figure. This is basically a heart. We can tell it's a heart, right? Um, but there's no ground or background essentially. Here, there is a foreground and a background. The foreground is, or sorry, the figure is the black and the ground is the white. We know this because this is a panda. Um, However, just like the phantom lines, this these are technically just blobs since this isn't um, have a line here or here. Um, there's those phantom lines occurring, but so our brain understands that this is trying to be a panda. So again, the figure would be the panda here, and the background would be the white. Um, Here is obviously a little bit more tricky. This is a MC Escher drawing. What's the figure? What are the things in the foreground? Well, you can say these black shapes, but then when you focus on the white, then those become the figure, right? So the figure and ground are interchangeable, right? And this next, oops. We have another slide that talks about that as far as positive negative space, which we'll get to later in this slideshow. Form, mass, volume. So now we're talking three-dimensional, right? Again, like I mentioned last week when I talked about dimension, everything still exists on the 2D plane, which is our screen. We're talking about the screen right here. Okay, so mass and volume in this case, these usually refer to like the physicality of a thing. So in the drawing, there's no real physicality to it. So on the left, we just see this circle, right? And on the right, we see a sphere because again, we can sort of perceive the circle on the right as a sphere because of the shading. We've seen things like this in real life. We know what lighting and shadow is, and we can interpret to the objects or images as three-dimensional. Okay. So yeah, that's having form. Uh, so yeah, and mass is intertwined with that. For example, so look at these two images. obviously, again, they're two-dimensional. On the bottom, it's a flat 2D photograph of a 3D sculpture, right? So so on the top, the Georgia O'Keeffe painting, um, I would say most people would say that they see these ice flows or whatever they are as receding into the distance, right? So we see them as objects with dimensionality. If you don't see that, you can just see it. You might think that they're just getting smaller in size the higher up they go, right? But humans were kind of trained to recognize these sort of dimensional aspects in 2D images. And then the bottom is Richard Serra, of course. It was in that I don't know if it was the Morley Safer or the Andy Rooney one. I think it was the Andy Rooney one where they talked about one of Richard Serra's pieces, um, Tilted Arc. But yeah, if you go see one of these in person, it makes more sense, um, uh, rather than just looking at pictures of it because it just looks like giant slabs of concrete or metal or whatever it is. But when you to see it in person, they're pretty impressive and kind of scary. Here's Rene Magritte, and a pretty famous surrealist, the painter that has like the apple in front of the guy in the bowler hat. Yeah, he painted this image, well, obviously. Um, and the more you think about, like, the funnier it is because it's a giant feather. Like, how does that change the relationship with this tower, right? We know feathers to be lighter, but in this case, it's kind of holding up the tower up, which doesn't make sense going about what we know from reality. Okay, and here's a 3D shape. With it depends on what shape you have. Most of them have a height, a length, and well, they all have height, length, and depth. Um, However, not all of them have faces, edges, or vertices. So the example here is a cube, which is a perfect rectangular prism, basically, but they'll always have three dimensions: up and down, forward and back, and left and right, essentially. Okay. And so you don't necessarily need to know these terms. This is just a helpful slide. And so we have open and closed forms. So this is the same form we have here. It's a treasure chest. However, on the left, it's obviously open. On the right, it's closed. So, on the left, if you put something in it, you could see it. If you put something in it on the right, you couldn't see it, right? Open and closed forms. Makes sense. This is from my friend Mandy Keithley. It's a mostly closed sculpture with a long vertical openness right there. This is another 3D. You can see it has the vertices, the edges, and the sides, and all sorts of other things going on. I really like it. Just another sculpture that I like, one of my favorite artists, just very messy, fun stuff. Okay, space. Let me check the time. Okay. So spaces is an interesting one because it can be applied in different aspects. So again, this is a different element of art. All right, so space refers to how the bits relate to each other and the canvas in terms of position. Okay, so on the right we have the sun, a cloud, raindrops, and a line. That's what we literally have. Okay, so however, there we don't, again, as humans, we sort of piece things together, right? So on the right, on this composition, um, they're not just randomly put there, right? We can sort of see that this is a little scene where it's a cloudy day. We know that because it's a cloud and it's blocking out the sun. We would imagine ourselves in this position on the ground, and raindrops coming from the cloud because that's where rain comes from the sky, from clouds. And yeah, and we understand that this is the ground because gravity exists and it has to end somewhere. right? So these, again, this isn't just a random composite of different items put together. No, we understand them as a whole. Okay, and here's different examples of different types of spacing. Okay, so like these are detached objects, they're autonomous, they exist on their own. And as a second sentence says, there's tension to describe the detached space. So right here, this feels pretty neutral, right? This one feels kind of lonely, whereas this one has this sort of it feels a little bit more active in its composition where there is that diagonal line, right? We're kind of getting closer like that, right? We perceive this as a little bit different than this, even though they're just squares put on the page. So touching objects, when they're actually touching, that implies a sort of what's called intimacy, which isn't necessarily like a romantic as it says here, but it's because they're touching, we see them as like related to each other in a sense. So these four are probably more, we will put those four together instead of like these four random ones, right? Because these have equal spacing, but these ones are all kind of touching together, so they have some sort of bond, which is shown physically. Union's another type. This is where the forms are kind of absorbed into each other, right? So it's like when you have a puddle of water and then you pour some more water in it, it's not two waters, it's one water that becomes more, right? So overlap is kind of different. So going back to that water example, it's if you have water and then you pour oil onto that puddle of water. They're still connected, they're still touching each other. However, the oil and the water don't mix, so they're still autonomous, even though they're mixing. Right. I don't have a really have a water metaphor for this, but intersection is when things combine, but you can still see each individual part, right? So it's a combination of overlap and union. It's pretty interesting. It's not often you see this in real life, um, but yeah, this is something that can happen. It happens mostly in like geometric paintings, but yeah, you don't really see this too often in any sort of sense because of the fact that physics exists and two things can't occupy the same space at the same time. And coinciding objects is basically grouping of objects with two or more things in common. For example, the color, the position, these things have all that in common. Sometimes mutual, sometimes different, but they're all connected together. Um, Same thing with this, right? They're not all in a row. They're not all in the same color. However, they have a few things that bonds them together, right? Like being intersected with the laser, for example. Okay, and subtraction, that's taking parts away from one thing. Um, you would, if you do Illustrator, you would be familiar with the Pathfinder function of subtraction. But yeah, so this is just taking things away in this, and as the bottom line says, it implies a passage of time. Think about what that means, right? What subtraction is and how that might be a function of time, right? Um, Basically before, after, right? Before we would think of this um, as a full circle that was bitten into, right? So this is like kind of the after. Transparency, which does exist, obviously, is the intersection of two objects. However, you can see them, the difference between them. Venn diagrams is a good example. Um, so yeah, like obviously this is um, a 2D image, but you can see that you can picture like maybe the blue being on the bottom and the yellow on top as like translucent um, pieces of fiberglass or whatever. And then when they intersect right here, it makes this green because we know green is blue plus yellow. All right, positive and negative space. Okay. So again, yeah, this is similar to the figure ground relationship. With positive space, it's the more active part of this. So in this composition, these little bits with the people on it, that would be the positive space, and everything around it would be the negative space. Okay, so what's interesting is even though there are like stars here and these little blocks here, this is mostly sort of detached from the positive space, right? For a more literal example, on the left here, the negative space is the gray around these two characters, right? And the positive space is these two characters. Okay, so that's a definite objective way of measuring positive and negative space. And so I want you to sort of challenge yourself here and think about what the positive and negative spaces are here. I do want to say that in this case, it can be a little bit more subjective. You can also maybe argue that there is no negative space, but that depends on how you're feeling. For me personally, I would say, even though there's all this fog going on, I'd say like this behind here, or that like this around the wolf, is probably the negative space because that's not what we're focused on necessarily. We're focused on the wolf yawning or whatever. And there's uh trees that are blurry in the background. Those aren't, or bushes, whatever. We can't really, we're not focused on that. That's not important. You can also maybe include the the breath or the fog or whatever as part of the positive space as well. And it's on top of the negative space in the background. Okay, so positive negative space in terms like this, it's more clear cut. In terms like this, not as much. And like this, um, it's pretty easy to tell, but you can maybe argue against it. But for this, because it's just mostly blue, it doesn't have these characters on here. We will definitely, most likely, I should say, we most likely see this as positive space. Oh, didn't mean to click on it. Perspective. Okay, so we are still in the space part of the elements of art. Let me check time. Okay, I need to kind of hurry up. So again, on 2D in on our 2D screens, we can see that three dimensions exist, or that they're implied, but that doesn't mean they really there because again we're looking at the screen. So perspective is a way to sort of trick our brains into seeing these art things on a 2D screen as 3D, right? But this also exists in 3D. We have perspective in 3D. Okay, and there'll be examples. um so yeah, let's watch this quick video. It'll play.
Here's some tips on basic understanding of perspective. Perspective is all about depth, and you get this with two main things: the horizon line and vanishing points. The horizon line is basically your eye level, and all lines showing depth converge to a point or points on that line. These points are called vanishing points, and they describe what 1-point, 2-point, and 3-point perspective are. We live in a three-dimensional world, so a good image is always going to show length, width, and height. A 1-point perspective is going to have the length lines going to a vanishing point, and the width and height are just going to stay straight. A 2-point perspective is going to have the length lines going to one vanishing point, the width lines going to another, and the height is just going to stay straight. So a 3-point perspective just has 1 point for each of them. A simple way to keep these straight is the following. A 1-point perspective is looking right down the street. A 2-point perspective is looking at that corner, and a 3-point perspective is looking at the top of a building on that street corner. 1, 2, try doing this. Draw the exact same background, except with...
Okay, so those are quick breakdowns. When you take a drawing class, well, if you take a drawing class, you'll have assignments like these. So this is examples of drawing assignments of 1-point perspective, 2-point perspective, and 3-point perspective. So I'm not going to go on too much about these because there's a lot that goes into it. The point, again, refers to the number of vanishing points. How do I... Okay, I need to go back into this. Okay. There's also 4 to 6-point perspectives. We're not going to go into this. Here's a link if you're interested in this. It's kind of weird and trippy stuff, but it's really, really cool. So yeah. Atmospheric perspective is basically the using a sense of space in a way. So the way this works is we can see what's in the foreground and what's in the background, even though they're kind of abstracted shapes. I mean, we know they're trees and dead trees, but the way this works is the reason we can see these mountains in the back, we know that those are further and they're lighter than the darker, clear, more clear trees in the front. As that air particles get in the way, right? There's air particles everywhere, and the further away they are, the denser they are. Because when we're looking in front of us, let's say there's like 5 air particles, and then 2 feet in front of us, there's 10 air particles because the 5 here and 5 here. Then you keep on adding those particles that sort of obstruct the view a little bit more. Just think about a foggy day. That's a very good example of atmospheric perspective, where we see depth because of the atmosphere or air particles, really. Yeah, we'll just, unable to play video. So this is a good way of showing perspective as well. So this is a portrait of Gerhard Richter. He's pictured here 3 times. This is him 3 times, not 3 different people. So that's, I mean, that's kind of important in understanding this, right? So on the left here, he appears, let's just say medium size. In the middle here, he's small size. And on the right-hand side, he's larger size. How do we know this? How do we know he didn't grow and shrink, right? We understand this as, oh, he's just closer to the camera, and here he's further away from the camera. Even though you don't really see a vanishing point here, we can tell just by experience and how cameras work and how vision works that it's the same guy. He's just in different positions there, right? So if you draw someone too large, it just might look like they're closer to the camera, right? Texture. Okay, so yeah, texture is a surface quality of an element. On the left-hand side, we're talking about actual texture. So like the fur and the blankies, those are actual textures. However, since this is inside a screen, it's not real textures. All right. So it's literally impossible to give you an example of actual textures unless we were in person and I could give you a blanket to feel. And when you felt that blanket, that would be an actual texture. Okay. And on the right hand side, this is an example of implied textures. So this is basically a material study, making different materials and objects into a cube. And so this artist basically drew these different things. I should have given the warning that it's kind of gross. My bad. So yeah, again, like even within this, how do I say it? So even if you made, let's say you made this into a physical print, right? You still couldn't fill the sushi on the top left. Like it would just be the ink, right? Um, Implied texture again is just what appears to be real, what's rendered to be real. Um, it's trying to convey a sense of feeling, incorporating the sense of touch, which isn't normally a thing in 2D artwork. Here's a couple examples. So there's actual texture in here. You can read more about this. Um, I can't say his first name, Albrecht Dürer. I think he's Dutch. So yeah, he's known. He was a prodigy basically, and he made these ultra like beautiful, realistic looking paintings with good textures and stuff like that. So there's a lot that you can't actually touch here again because it's only implied. There are exceptions to paintings having texture is when there's impasto. Okay, so that's Italian for mixture or dough, as it says there. So yeah, there's some paintings where there's actual physical texture. Sometimes that may reflect the the objects in the painting itself. Sometimes it's just the person's style where they just want to lay it on thick. Okay, so in Van Gogh, let's see, pronounce his name more like that. Um, so yeah, for detail Starry Night, sometimes his paintings, uh, the actual texture does correspond with the objects in the painting. So it's both implied and actual texture, whereas these are more, well, these are abstract pieces, and there's physical texture there. And we know this because the lighting produces shadows here, which is important to this. And we'll talk about Robert Ryman, kind of. Basically, we'll talk about white paintings later this term. Here's a picture of a bird, a real bird and a not real bird, but they both have texture, which is kind of funny. I don't know, just kind of random. All right, color, my favorite part. All right, so color is basically, it's hard to really talk about in physics terms because I don't know physics, but it's just frequencies of electromagnetic radiation. Um, so, so as this image tells us, the color that we see on an object, it's what's reflected off of that object. Okay, it's kind of confusing, but whatever. Um, I read this in 2007 when this was made, and it really stuck in my head, so I decided to include it, but I'm not going to read it. Too much to go over. All right, so we perceive light through the rods in our eyes. So the rods here is what we can perceive as light and dark. Um, and then we also have cones in our eyes, which perceives red, green, and blue. Okay, and so this is if you are able to see all colors. If you're colorblind, you're missing some of the cones or they're not functioning. There's different types of color blindness where some work and others don't. I don't know all the different types, but there's places online where you can see the differences between them, and it's pretty interesting. Okay, additive color. All right, so additive color is using light. Okay, so why is it called additive color? Because you need to add color in order to get to white. Okay, so we have a red light on the bottom, a blue light on the top left, and a green light on the top right. So, these are their own separate colors, but when you combine all three of them together, you get white. So additive color happens when, again, you add light. So I'm going to show this video. You can see this white that they're composed of red, green, and blue. Get rid of the sound. So we're zooming in, and you can see that oh, we're looking up there, that white is not really white here, but they're so close to each other here that it appears to be white, because when you're adding light, it gets brighter and brighter and brighter and closer to white. Um, so yeah, that's all we really need to see there. The opposite is, of course, subtractive color. So this is more about things you put on paper, like pigments, ink, paint, watercolor, etc. It's called subtractive light because in order to get closer to white, you need to subtract colors. Whereas when you add light, it gets closer to black. Okay. It took me years to remember the difference between those two. So if you don't understand that right away, that's fine. Subtractive means you need to subtract colors to get to white. Additive means you need to add colors to get to white. Okay. So yeah. Like using watercolor, or actually using highlighters, is a good example. Start off with yellow, add some cyan, then add some magenta, and it gets darker and darker and darker. Okay, so I think a lot of us might be familiar with CMYK, which is basically, in our printers we have cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. So yeah, why do we have those colors? So you can see the intersection of red and blue is magenta, blue and green is cyan, and green and red is yellow. Okay, so that's why we get those colors. That's why we print with those colors, right? And that's a subtractive process. Also, fun fact, sometimes the case, it depends on who you ask, but the CMYK, the K stands for either key or black. So key meaning it's like just basically like here's an anchor, here's a key, or it could just mean black, right? So that's what that means. However, yeah, we're taught in like grade school that red, yellow, and blue are the primary colors. Why? It's actually something that's kind of outdated, and it doesn't reflect the science that we use today. It is still valid, but I guess it's just an easier way for kids to learn. I argue it's not necessary, but if what makes sense now, because that's what our world is built upon, just based on tradition. Okay, so yeah, we're definitely going to go over the time limit. So I'll try to get it go a little bit faster. So HSB, so H is hue, which means the wavelength of any given color. So that means, is it red, green, blue, purple, etc., etc. Saturation is the purity of a color. So if it's purely saturated, that means it's that hue that's very, very vibrant. If you take away the saturation, it just becomes white, basically. And the brightness is the lightness or darkness of a color. So yeah, that pretty self-explanatory. The darker it is, the less bright it is. HSB is a color space based on human vision, blah, blah, blah. But so this slide is showing 3 different gamuts. So this is a gamut is a set of colors that can be utilized by a system. So this whole circle is all the colors a human can see. The RGB color gamut, which is basically screen based, like anything that you see on the screen is using RGB little lights that has this range of color that it can use. And CMYK is a smaller, and this is what we print. So if you're basically, this is a really good slide to know about, because within the human experience of what we can see, assuming you're not colorblind, not every color on the screen that we see on our phones is visible or is able to exist on those screens. So what we can see with our own eyes is more than what can be shown on screens. And so when you print a color photo or something like that, You'll notice that the colors look kind of weird or different than they did on the screen. That's because the CMYK, the subtractive color gamut, there's less colors available there, right? So it's kind of based on physics and stuff like that. So let's not get into that. All right, so color wheel. So again, we're sort of in the society that uses red, yellow, and blue as primary colors, and we base our color wheel off of that. You can create your own color wheel if you want, but this is what everyone just uses, again, based on tradition. It's what we've been taught since kids, so we're just gonna use it, I guess. And that's fine. So now we're separating them into warm colors and cool colors. So warm colors are obviously the reds, orange, yellows. We associate that with fire and such. And cool colors, which is like ice or whatever, green, blue, purple, essentially. So warm colors. So these can symbolize a bunch of different things, but yeah, we symbolize it with warmth. Maybe this isn't such a warm, inviting painting, but maybe you're like, oh, this big red guy is really cute. I want to go hang out with him, you know. But it also like literal heat, right? Which we see in fire, which is a lot of energy going on. So here, this is kind of a macabre painting. Red is very bloody and sort of ominous. The ground itself, which is brown, brown is essentially a dark, less saturated orange. So even though it might seem neutral, it is more warm than it is cool. Okay. Here's other ones that might be actually be a little less. I guess they are pretty weird. I'm not going to apologize because weird. I like weird stuff. Cool colors, which is the opposite, obviously. Green, blue, and purple. So we can see on the right hand side that these aren't just like white hills or hills made of cocaine. They're. I saw Cocaine Bear recently. That's why that's on my mind. I don't do it. But anyways, we see this as snow. We might get a little chill looking at this. So yeah, it implies coolness and more like rest, because there's less energy in cool spaces. And here's putting them together. So this is from the game AER Memories of Old. So the character right here in the middle, we're more in a warm space. We're illuminated here. And then we can see down here it's cooler, which means it might be less occupied, might be a little bit scarier to go to, whereas we have the nice warm light here. So there's a lot of psychology behind putting these two things together and where they exist in relationship to each other. Complementary colors, so they're opposite on the color wheel. So in this example, we have red and green here, the green buildings and the red here. This can make things appear more intense. The red really in this painting, the red creature really stands out against the green buildings, right? It has this sense of energy, scariness, vibrancy that the building, the green, which again is a cool color, has this like stillness to it. So there's contrast there. This is something you can do on your own. Basically, I would say, yeah, just do this on your own and you'll understand why it's there. Analogous colors. So these are close to each other on the color wheel. So on the color wheel here, we're like this pretty much, and with a little bit here. So yeah, these are colors that are next to each other on the color wheel. Okay, as you can see in this painting right here, I think it's AI art. I used a lot of AI art last year before I understood the controversy. But yeah, so this has a sort of unity to the scene, right? Because they're all pretty similar colors. There's exceptions like this orange here and this red here, but mostly they fall within this certain range. Okay. I keep on forgetting that bear eating apple thing exists, this slide. Yeah, those are apples, not oranges. Triadic colors are not seen very often because it's really intense. I have a really hard time finding images with triadic colors, but yeah, they're spaced evenly apart. These are all three primary colors. Oh yeah, here's another example of three primary colors, or in this case, secondary colors, which is even harder to find to combine green, purple, and orange, which are spaced evenly apart. Um, yeah, they're very, very, very vibrant here. It might remind you of elementary school. Secondary colors, it seems a little bit more like witchy or creepy or mysterious. At least I think so. And this screenshot exemplifies that. Split complementary. You'll rarely come across this unless like you're specifically doing something split complementary. That means complementary colors, but one of the sides, you use a color on either side of that one. So yeah, so instead of using this blue and this yellow orange, use this blue and this orange and this yellow. It's kind of confusing. And this image is kind of a stretch, but there is split complementary here, but it kind of gives you an example of what that might look like. It has this really weird feeling towards it. Tetradic is really gnarly. So it's two sets of complementary colors. So here would be red and green and yellow and purple. As you can see, it's kind of gaudy and kind of ugly, so you don't really see it that much. Um, so I probably never recommend using it unless there's certain exceptions like this kind of neo noir Bowser and Bowser Jr. scene. So achromatic, that means no color at all. So what's fun is that a fun fact that you can use at parties to make people not like you is when someone says something's monochromatic, when it's just black and white, you could say, nope, actually it's achromatic. Um, don't do that. Honestly, if someone says something's monochromatic when it's black and white, just be okay with it, honestly. But if you want to be technical, yeah, it's achromatic. It doesn't have any color at all. So black, white, and grays. And monochromatic is, of course, one hue. So on this bottom left, it's obviously blue. Variation in saturation brightness. So there's lighter blues and darker blues here. It also extends to black and white. So yeah, if it's just one color using variation, that's monochromatic. And that's the difference. This game, Cairo by Richard Perrin, has a lot of monochromatic scenes. And on the top right, top left, and these two, they're achromatic. This is also monochromatic by Gerhard Richter. Just blue, gray, blue and grays making an image. Local color versus observed color. So this is an interesting one because on the right hand, on left hand, we know that strawberries are red because we're humans. If we're a bee or something or another creature, it might not be that color. But we know these are red, and that's the natural color as it exists in white light. Okay. So the observed color, that's different because, sorry, we call that local color, and the observed color is what we perceive. So we know strawberries are red, right? But when we put this cyan filter on top of it, um, it's the colors here are actually gray, um, which really messes with our minds because we can still see this as red, right? However, we do understand that putting things in different lights doesn't change like the local color of the thing. Like putting glasses on that are green doesn't change, or that are cyan, don't change the strawberries' colors to red, right? Um, it's kind of well, I'll talk about a question in a bit. So color balance in photography um, is basically the same thing as correcting the color to make something less orange or less blue than it naturally is. So as you can see, here's an orange tint and here's a blue tint when this is a natural color. And so Duncan is a alligator crocodile. I don't remember, but you can see this is his natural color here, and we can see that these are scenes in like shade or darkness in the TV or whatever. And so it's a different color, but we can still see him as this green alligator crocodile. Okay, so yeah, so let me make sure. Yeah, so in this scene you can see the colors changing. So do the tiles change color? Um, it depends if you want to talk about in observed color or local color. So in local color, it might be like just a plain gray or whatever. But under observed color, when it has this red tint, we might see it as red. So yeah, it's both. Um, I'll just go to this example. So basically here, like you're equally correct if you say this is gray or this is red. You just have to specify it's red under local color, but the observed color is gray. Okay. Human perception is fun. And symbols. So this is a pretty good video about the symbols of different colors, which aren't always consistent from culture to culture, from person to person, even. But a lot of them do tend to mean the same thing. Like things such as um, like purple, they don't really mean anything. It's that royalty and decadence. It's based on like how expensive pigments were in a long time ago. But something like black as darkness as unknown, like that's a little bit more universal, right? So some of it is based on perception, reality, culture, whatever. So it's a mix of what symbols mean to different cultures, different people, etc. Value is how much I love you. Haha, just kidding. But it means the lightness or darkness. So on the left hand side, we see a painting by Helen Frankenthaler, one of my favorite artists, has a lot of light values in it. On the right hand side, it's extremely dark and extremely light. So there's very dark values and very light values. This is an interesting one because Tim the Wolf, he's wearing what we can see as a dark gray sweater, right? So that has a very dark value. But the window light coming in kind of creates this bloom effect of light shining in on it. And you can see like on the edges here, it has a light value to it. So there's a really interesting mix of light and dark values here. This is important for the quiz. Walks in the bubble bath? Yes, it's true. All right. Principles of design. Yeah, we're running a little bit late, but that's okay. So principles of design are, if you can believe it, even more subjective than elements of art. And the way I compiled these is I took the 10 top Google results of what are the principles of design, and I sort of made a spreadsheet and balanced out which is which, and so this is pretty much what came out of that. So yeah, these are principles of design. This is how like how to use, these are like tools to use to communicate your ideas, as it says on the slide that I could have just read out. So balance, yeah, balance refers to how you weigh things from one end to the other, from top to bottom, left to right, forward to back. And the two examples that are given are symmetrical and asymmetrical. So this painting, Magritte again. So this has a nice symmetrical balance to it because we have these four quadrants that are separated here, and they kind of have equal weight visually. Like, yeah, this has less visual weight than this does. By visual weight, I mean how much is space is being taken up, right? But they're all pretty much evenly placed. This maze, even though that's like not obviously symmetrical, the balance here is pretty symmetrical because there's pretty much a nice amount of blank space on all four corners. Yeah, it varies a little bit, but it's generally all placed here in the middle. Whereas this painting, a lot of the emphasis is on the right. So there's a huge asymmetrical balance here. Yeah, there's clouds here, but this has a lot less detail than it does here, right? And this is just kind of blank space or negative space, as we learned earlier, right? So there's a lot of asymmetrical balance in this one. Oh, jeez. Keep on forgetting that happens. Contrast. So contrast is an interesting one because it has overlap um, with other principles of design. Okay, so contrast is basically how things relate to each other and how different or similar they are. So contrast here, so they're the exact same shape pretty much, but the contrast here lies or lay in the colors, right? So even though there's little contrast between the shapes, there's huge contrast between the colors. So pretend this light green is white, but yeah, there's so much contrast here because there's no gray middle tones. It's just black and white. And yeah, you might think, oh yeah, this is gray here, but these are just dithered, which means like spaces between black dots to make it appear gray. Okay, so there's a lot of contrast there, again, because it's either black or white. Emphasis. So this is basically putting one element in front of the other as far as what's more important, right? So what's the emphasis in this? Obviously, it's the light book with light shining directly on it that's on the pedestal, whereas everything else in the scene is dark. So there's a lot of emphasis on the book in this scene. Again, like I said, with contrast, there's a lot of overlap. So there's a lot of contrast between the book and the rest of the scene. But emphasis is a little bit more specific in that we're emphasizing one important element here. It could be two elements, but usually whatever has the emphasis on it is distinct and usually unmistakable. For here, the emphasis here is obviously the tiger, because everything else is boring office stuff. It's black in front and then tan floor, kind of boring, right? Whereas we have this like silly little creature with a maroon sweater on, right? And he's placed in the middle. So this is a more interesting one and much more subjective one. What's the emphasis here to you? Some people might say this very bright sunlight, especially if you're in a dark room right now. Some people might say this giant dark shape here that's like right in front of us and block and creates a disruption in this whole peaceful scene, right? This is from Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice. Some people might go to this shape, right? So for this one, it's more ambiguous of what the emphasis is, which is interesting, right? So I said it's usually non-ambiguous. Well, sometimes it is ambiguous, like everything else in life. But most people would probably pick either this area here or this area here. Scale and proportion. So we know scale as how big or how small things are, and proportion is how that size relates to each other. So how it relates to other bits. Okay, so within this composition, who is who in the family? These are from Bluey, which is a children's show from Australia. We can probably figure out that, well, this is an older dog. These are probably younger dogs based on the fact that animals grow, right? Probably a parent because these little kids are comfortable around this bigger dog. So based on the scale and proportion, we can sort of understand things a little bit better. So if you give sharks legs and make them really, really big, it becomes really, really weird. And if you have a bear with really, really, really long legs, it's pretty creepy. These are some of my favorite slides. So yeah, scale and proportion tells you how things are in relationship to each other. So these legs, this bear wouldn't be as creepy if the rest of the bear, the torso, the arms, and the head were a lot larger. But they're not. Hierarchy. So this is arrangement of elements in regards to importance and significance. What's a hierarchy here? So well, I'm going to answer it, obviously. But obviously, it is the bear who has these regal robes on. They're the focus of this composition. They're standing up, whereas we see a student down here sitting down in the background on the side of the frame. So, yeah, the hierarchy here is kind of obvious who's the person in charge. Okay, I mean, there's plenty of other indicators as well. Visual hierarchy. I don't like the writing here. It's hard to read, but basically the visual hierarchy here is on the left-hand side, here's some cliffs and some clouds, but you can see it's kind of cluttered because there's a lot of detail in the clouds. Whereas here, there's less detail in the clouds, and it makes these little rock formations stand out a little bit more. So this is the opposite of hierarchy, where all the elements here are the same. You can argue that the top left is always has higher place in the hierarchy than the bottom right. However, they're given equal visual weight, and as far as size is concerned. Unity and variety. So this is how things are similar / different. So here, even though these are different drawings and they're different, I mean, they're the same horseshoe crabs, but they're different organisms. They all have the same shape, they all have the same color, so you can assume that they're kind of the same species, right? The same type of things. Whereas here in variety, there's a lot of differences between these characters, right? You can tell that they're probably not in the same family or biological family, maybe the same chosen family. But yeah, you can see that they're different species, they're different sizes, different modes of transportation, whether that's underground or walking. Unity and variety in this image, the hats are similar, the colors are not. Pattern repetition. So it's how elements, or sorry, where bits repeat consistently throughout a composition. I need to change the elements to bits. Pattern and repetition. Where is it here? Well, that's the whole painting, right? A lot of repetition. In this example, it creates a sort of like weird movement, weird pattern that's kind of cool and appealing and satisfying. Here, it's a little bit more irregular, but we can still see that it's still consistent in the fact that these are, well, it's called steps. But if you didn't see that, you could probably gather that these are steps and they have a similar pattern, not exactly, but we can still see that these three still belong together. They're not random or whatever, because there's some internal logic and consistency. And rhythm and movement. So movement is implied motion that's not actually there because pictures are still. And rhythm is how your eye moves through it. These are usually combined for some reason. I think they're kind of different, but you could argue both ways. Okay, so on the left, okay, I was like, what? On the left here, where is the movement? How do we know that this person's not like frozen and floating in midair, right? In some senses, it's because of how the photo is taken, how there's like this light trail here. We also can see like his eyes are looking down here. So he's probably going from here to here based on our knowledge of physics and probably seeing Tony Hawk's Pro Skater. So we have this implied knowledge that, yeah, this guy is probably not floating because also that's impossible. So he's probably going from here to here. Okay. And so there's rhythm here, right? So there's this grouping of 4 peach lines, a larger break, and then 4 more peach lines, right? So there's sort of a rhythm of like start, stop, start, right? Very minimal, but we still get a sense of movement. And here's a visual illusion where things aren't actually like slanted, but it's the illusion of where the squares are placed that makes it look like that. So yeah, that's the lecture. Um, just a reminder, I'm gonna unlock the week 3 stuff and add a Discord channel and upload the video. But yeah, so thanks for watching this. I really, really appreciate that. Everyone should be doing it. But yeah, and if you're here for the live stream, thank you so much for showing up. I appreciate it, and I'll see you on Discord. Bye bye.